Most organizations believe Showback creates accountability. They are wrong. Showback creates visibility, and visibility feels like control, therefore everyone relaxes. But nothing changes, because nothing in the system is forced to change. A dashboard is not a decision, a report is not an escalation path, and a monthly cost review is not governance. This episode is about the trap. You can instrument spend perfectly and still drift into financial chaos. Then we'll convert that theater into an operating model with consequences, ownership, guardrails, workflows, and the one governance decision that prevents most drift. Definitions that people blur on purpose: showback, chargeback, accountability. Words matter because the platform doesn't care about your intentions. It only cares about what is enforced. So let's clean up the definitions people blur, usually because the blur keeps everyone comfortable. Showback is attribution without impact. It answers, who did we think spent this money? It produces a report, a Power BI page, a set of tags, maybe a cost allocation model. It is the passive voice of financial management. Costs were incurred. And because no budget moves, no one's incentives change. Showback is telemetry. Telemetry is useful. Telemetry is not a control. Chargeback is impact without necessarily intelligence. Chargeback answers, who is paying? The spend hits a cost center, a department budget, a P&L. Now people feel it. And yes, that can drive behavior. But chargeback also creates a predictable pathology. Teams optimize for appearing cheap, not for being effective. They will defer work, under-provision, shift spend to different buckets, argue about allocations, and hide behind shared services ambiguity. Chargeback turns cost into conflict if the ownership model is weak. So neither of these is accountability. They are accounting mechanisms with different side effects. Accountability is owned decisions plus enforced constraints plus an audit trail. That distinction matters. Accountability means a human or team can say, this spend exists because we chose it, we can justify it, and we accept the trade-offs. And it also means the platform can say no. Not metaphorically, literally, deny at deploy time, quarantine at runtime, escalate when budgets breach, create evidence when exceptions are granted. If the system cannot refuse a bad decision, you are not running governance. You are running persuasion, and persuasion does not scale. Here's why finance loves Showback and engineering tolerates it. Finance likes Showback because it creates the appearance of responsibility without triggering organizational warfare. It's safe. It doesn't require reworking budgeting models. It doesn't require leaders to fight each other over shared costs. It doesn't require anyone to tell a powerful team, you don't get to do that. It produces artifacts that look like progress. Allocation percentages, variance charts, forecasts, trend lines. Engineering tolerates Showback because it rarely blocks delivery. Engineers can nod at the dashboard, explain the spike, and go back to shipping. If the Showback meeting becomes annoying, they send a delegate. If it becomes political, they stop showing up. The work still happens, the cloud still bills, the system keeps running, the bill keeps growing. Now, the early warning sign that you are in cost theater is simple. If you cannot answer, quickly, who owns this cost? You do not have governance. You have a reporting layer over a mess. And owns doesn't mean is aware of. It means who is obligated to respond when the spend deviates, and who has authority to change the conditions that created the spend. A distribution list is not an owner. A FinOps team is not the owner of every workload. A central platform team is not magically responsible for every developer's bad sizing decisions. Ownership is a control plane. It defines who can approve, who can say no, and who can accept risk. And the more your organization scales, the more this becomes non-negotiable. Because at scale, cloud spend isn't a budgeting problem. It's a decision volume problem. Thousands of small choices: SKU selection, region, retention, replication, idle compute, premium licensing, temporary sandboxes accumulate into a financial outcome. Showback observes the outcome. Accountability shapes the decisions. So when people say we're doing FinOps, we have Showback, what they usually mean is we can measure the blast radius. They cannot stop it. They cannot route it to an accountable owner. They cannot enforce a timeout on exceptions. They cannot prevent the next identical mistake. This is where the trap closes. Showback becomes a substitute for governance. Everyone can point at the dashboard and say, we're on it. Meanwhile, the system's incentives remain unchanged and Entropy does what Entropy does. In reality, the goal is not to pick Showback versus Chargeback as if one is more mature. The goal is to design accountability so that visibility turns into action by default. And once the definitions are clean, the rest of the episode becomes obvious. Showback fails at scale because it is an observer pattern with no actuator. Why Showback fails at scale? The observer pattern with no actuator. Showback fails for the same reason monitoring fails when it isn't paired with response. It's an observer pattern with no actuator. The system can detect, it can display, it can email, it can hold a meeting, but it cannot force a decision and it cannot force a change. So Showback becomes a strange kind of organizational comfort. Everyone can see the fire, therefore everyone feels like they did something about the fire. But there are no sprinklers. There's no automatic shut-off valve. There isn't even a fire warden with authority to evacuate the building. And the uncomfortable truth is, In large organizations, someone should do something is the same as no one will. Here's what most people miss. Cloud costs aren't one big decision. They're a continuous stream of micro decisions made by hundreds of people across dozens of systems. If you expect a monthly report to correct a daily decision stream, you're not doing governance, you're doing archaeology. The organizational gravity is predictable. Urgent delivery beats cost hygiene every time. The sprint is due. The incident just happened. The customer escalated. A security finding came in, and then a FinOps dashboard shows a 12% cost increase. Everyone agrees it's a problem. Then everyone goes back to what gets them promoted, because Showback doesn't change incentives. It doesn't create deadlines. It doesn't create accountability that survives competing priorities. It just creates information. And information is abundant. Attention is scarce. This is how dashboards turn into rituals. The weekly cost review becomes a status meeting where teams explain what already happened. The goal becomes have an explanation, not change the system. That people show up with narratives. That spike was a load test. That's the new region rollout. And that's because we had to scale for the campaign. That's shared networking. That's a reserved instance true-up. Most of those explanations are even true, but they don't produce outcomes because the meeting has no authority boundary. Nobody in the room can enforce anything. Nobody can deny a deployment. Nobody can quarantine an unowned resource. Nobody can expire an exception. So the only thing the organization can do is talk about it again next week. Over time, cost drift becomes normalized and then defended. Because once drift becomes normal, anyone trying to stop it looks like they're slowing the business down. And that label is fatal in most enterprises. So even when people know the environment is wasteful, they protect the waste because it protects delivery velocity and political safety. This is also why the incentive mismatch is structural, not moral. Engineering optimizes for throughput and stability. The organization rewards shipping. It rewards uptime. It rewards feature delivery. It rewards being the team that unblocks everyone else. It does not reward variance reduction. It does not reward deleting resources. It does not reward making a messy shared platform bill allocatable. So Showback asks engineering teams to do work that looks like risk with no visible upside. It's not that they don't care about money. It's that the system has trained them to care about different consequences. And that's the point. Governance is the art of defining consequences. Showback defines none. Here's the part where people get confused. They think the problem is the data quality. They think the dashboard needs better tagging, better allocation rules, more granular reporting, or a prettier Power BI layout. No, the data can be perfect and the behavior can still be wrong because the issue is not visibility. The issue is actuation. Actuation means when spend deviates, something happens automatically. A ticket is opened, an owner is assigned. A response window is defined. An escalation path exists. Exceptions have to be requested, approved, and expired. Unowned assets get quarantined. Guardrails block known bad decisions at deploy time. Without those mechanics, Showback is just a cost weather report. Accurate, interesting, ignored. And the larger the environment gets, the more brutal this becomes. At small scale, heroics can work. A few people can manually hunt waste. A few teams can coordinate through goodwill. But at scale, heroics turn into burnout, and goodwill turns into ambiguity. Therefore, the pattern is consistent. Showback creates awareness, awareness creates meetings, meetings create explanations, and explanations create permission for the status quo to continue. This is not a failure of character. It is a failure of system design. And once you accept that, the path forward becomes clear. You don't need more observers. You need actuators. Cost entropy. The inevitable drift of tags, ownership, and intent. Everything clicked for a lot of teams when they stopped treating cloud cost as an accounting artifact and started treating it as an architectural property. Accounting happens after the fact. Architecture defines what can happen in the first place. Cloud spin behaves like security posture. It degrades unless you continuously apply pressure. Not because people are sloppy, but because complex systems drift, teams change, names change, ownership shifts, tooling evolves. The platform adds new SKUs, new regions, new billing meters, new licensing bundles. The environment doesn't stay still long enough for your spreadsheet to remain true. That drift has a name, cost entropy. Entropy is not a metaphor here. It's the unavoidable tendency for metadata, ownership, and intent to decay over time unless the system forces renewal. If you rely on voluntary upkeep, you're not managing cost, you're hoping. And hope is not an operating model. Here's what most people miss. Tags and allocation rules are not good hygiene. They are allocation primitives. They are the only way to map a real invoice back to a human decision maker. When those primitives drift, accountability collapses first and cost optimization collapses right after that. So what are the entropy generators? Untagged resources are the obvious one. Not because tagging is magical, but because untagged resources are anonymous. And anonymous things don't get deleted. They don't get right-sized. They don't get challenged. They just keep billing in silence. Then you get shared services, the platform subscription, the networking resource group, the logging workspace everyone uses. Shared services are legitimate, but they're also the perfect hiding place for cost ambiguity. If you don't have an allocation model that is agreed, enforced, and periodically revisited, shared costs turn into a permanent argument. And permanent arguments are a form of financial waste. Undefined owners are worse than missing tags because they create the illusion that someone owns it. People point at an ops team or a cloud team or an IT cost center and call it accountability. It isn't. That's just routing spend into a bucket where nobody has product-level intent. Then there's the most common generator, temporary resources with no expiry. Dev environments, migration replicas, diagnostics enabled just for a week, premium tiers just for launch, trials just to evaluate, an extra region just for resilience testing. The cloud is incredibly good at turning temporary into forever because it never asks you to renew the decision. It bills, so the cost becomes scheduled. Not in a calendar sense, in a system sense. If you allow resources to exist without an owner, without allocation metadata, and without an enforced lifecycle, then the future invoice is not a surprise. It is the expected output of your design. This is the part finance often misunderstands. They ask for better tagging compliance as if it's a training issue. It isn't. It's a creation time enforcement issue. Because drift mechanics are structural. New teams show up. Reorgs happen. Mergers happen. Vendors change. A product gets renamed. A cost center gets split. People leave. Distribution lists rot. Tags stay behind like fossils. Meanwhile, your Showback report still confidently allocates spend to a team that no longer exists, a cost center that got retired, or an owner who changed roles 6 months ago. And everyone treats the report as truth because it has numbers. This is why tag decay is so corrosive. It doesn't just break reporting. It breaks the decision loop. You can't route anomalies to owners if ownership is stale. You can't enforce budgets if budgets aren't mapped to accountable teams. You can't run exception governance if you can't even find who requested the exception. So the system quietly converts deterministic accountability into probabilistic accountability. Sometimes the right person sees the report, sometimes they don't, sometimes they can act, sometimes they can't. And that randomness is what makes cost drift feel unpredictable, when in reality it's completely predictable. Unmanaged systems drift and drift accumulates. This is the uncomfortable truth. The real FinOps work is entropy management. It's making sure resources remain mappable to intent. And if you don't enforce intent at creation time, owner, cost center, workload, environment, you will spend the rest of your time doing archaeology. You'll dig through bills, chase teams, argue about allocation, and relitigate old decisions. That's not governance. That's cleanup after governance failed. So now we stop talking in abstractions and we map the failures. Because once you can name the failure modes, you can build systems that prevent them. Failure mode 1, ignored dashboards and the myth of informed teams. This failure mode is the one people defend the hardest because it sounds reasonable. We gave teams the data. They're informed. Now they can make better choices. No, they can explain their choices. That's what the dashboard actually enables. In a large environment, a cost report is not a trigger. It's a reference document for the next meeting where everyone explains why the spend was inevitable. And because the organization confuses explanation with control, the same offenders show up every month like clockwork. Here's what's happening mechanically. A dashboard tells you what happened after the spend already occurred. It doesn't change starting conditions. It doesn't stop new resources from being created with missing tags. It doesn't stop premium SKUs from being selected just in case. It doesn't expire the dev subscription that was meant to live for 2 weeks. It doesn't force anyone to choose between keeping the spend and changing the design. So teams can read the report, nod, and still do nothing because nothing in the system requires closure. The missing object is always the same: a decision owner with authority and obligation. Awareness without obligation is trivia. Obligation without authority is cruelty. A lot of organizations accidentally choose the worst option. They assign obligation to a central FinOps team and authority to everyone else. The FinOps team gets to chase, escalate, and plead. Engineering teams keep the ability to deploy, resize, and ignore. That's not accountability, that's a help desk for financial entropy. The second missing piece is the system, a workflow that forces a decision to end in one of 3 states: accept, mitigate, transfer. If a cost anomaly shows up, somebody has to either accept it as an intentional spend with documented rationale, mitigate it with a change and a due date, or transfer it by formally escalating the budget impact to a higher owner who can approve the trade-off. That's governance, a closed loop. Showback is an open loop. It creates perpetual motion meetings, and that's why cost reports get read and still produce no action, because action requires friction. It requires a moment where the system says choose, and the choice has to be recorded because without an audit trail, the organization will relitigate the same spike forever. This is where the hidden cost of Showback shows up. You spend time arguing about data instead of changing reality. People love to claim the cost data is wrong. Sometimes it is. Usually it's incomplete. But the pattern is predictable. When there's no actuator, people attack the observer. They debate tags, they debate allocation rules, they debate whether shared services are being charged fairly. They debate whether a reservation true-up counts. None of that reduces spend volatility. None of it reduces orphaned inventory. None of it makes the next month different. It just creates a safe technical argument that avoids the real question: who is going to do what, by when, and what happens if they don't? So the practical signal that you're stuck in this failure mode is painfully simple. Look at your top offenders across 3 months. If the same subscriptions, the same workloads, the same resource groups, or the same license pools keep appearing near the top, you don't have a cost problem. You have a governance problem. Because a one-time spike can be legitimate, a repeating spike is a policy failure that the organization has chosen to tolerate. And once it's tolerated, teams learn the real rule: nothing happens. That's the informed teams myth in its final form. Everyone is informed. Everyone is still optimizing for delivery. Therefore, the dashboard becomes a cultural artifact. Proof that someone cared, not proof that anything changed. This is why the fix is not more reporting cadence. The fix is to define closure. Every anomaly creates a work item. Every work item has an owner. Every owner has a response window, and every response ends in a recorded decision. Until you have that, Showback is just a monthly ritual where the organization watches itself drift in high resolution. Failure mode 2, exception debt and policy without teeth. The second failure mode is worse than ignored dashboards because it looks like governance. You have policies, you have standards, you have a FinOps playbook. You might even have a cloud center of excellence that publishes guardrails. And then you have exceptions. Exceptions are not rare events in enterprise cloud. They are the normal operating state. And that's fine until you treat exceptions as harmless paperwork. Because architecturally, an exception is an entropy generator. It creates a second rule set. And a second rule set always multiplies ambiguity. The common story is always the same. Just for this release, just for this region, just for this customer, just until the migration is done, just until we refactor, just until Microsoft fixes the feature gap. Every time someone says just, the system hears forever. Not because people lie, because nobody enforces an end date. This is what policy without teeth actually means. Policies exist as documentation, but the platform still allows violations by default. So policy becomes optional. And once a policy is optional, it's not a policy, it's a suggestion. That distinction matters. In mature organizations, a policy is a constraint with an explicit exception lane. In immature ones, a policy is a PDF and exceptions are an email thread. The difference is not bureaucracy, it's survivability. Here's how exception debt accumulates. First, you grant an exception with no owner. It's approved by a committee or signed off by someone who isn't responsible for paying the bill. So nobody carries the operational burden of the exception later. That exception now exists in limbo. Second, you grant an exception with no end date. So there is no future moment where the system forces a redecision. No renewal, no review, no do we still need this. Third, you grant an exception with no review cadence. So even if someone intended to revisit it, the revisit never arrives. There's always a bigger fire. That's exception debt. And it behaves exactly like security debt. It compounds. Not metaphorically, mechanically. Because once one team gets an exception, other teams learn the real process. The policy is negotiable, so they request their own carve-outs. Then your standard becomes a set of loosely related guidelines with dozens of undocumented overrides. And the only people who understand the real rules are the people who were in the meeting 6 months ago. Those people leave, and the exceptions stay. This is where governance collapses into conditional chaos. You no longer have a deterministic model where the organization can say, this is allowed, this is denied. You have a probabilistic model where outcomes depend on who asked, when they asked, and how loud the escalation was. Now, cost governance becomes politics, and politics is expensive. The practical impact shows up in 2 places. 1, cost allocation breaks. Because exceptions usually bypass tagging requirements, or they use temporary tags, or they deploy into shared subscriptions just for now. So when finance asks, who owns this cost? The answer becomes, it's complicated. And it's complicated is the prelude to unallocated spend. 2, enforcement collapses. As your policy becomes audit mode forever, budgets become alerts that go to a mailbox, and workflows become someone should investigate. So you end up with the worst possible combination. You have rules that slow down the teams who comply, and you have no control over the teams who don't. That's why policies without enforcement create resentment. The compliant teams feel punished, the exception teams feel empowered, and the central governance group becomes the villain for trying to restore basic discipline. The fix is not be stricter. The fix is to make exceptions real. Real exceptions have 5 properties: an accountable owner, a scoped blast radius, a justification tied to business intent, a review date, and an expiry date. If any of those is missing, you didn't grant an exception. You created a permanent bypass. And permanent bypasses are how organizations drift from FinOps into we don't know what we're paying for. So when you hear we have policies as proof of governance, the only correct response is show the enforcement mechanism. If the platform cannot block the violation, if the workflow cannot force renewal, and if the exception cannot expire, then the policy has no teeth. It's a wish list with a logo on it, and the bill will treat it exactly exactly that way. Failure mode 3, shadow subscriptions and spend outside the graph. And then there's the third failure mode, the one that makes Showback look almost responsible. Shadow subscriptions. Spend that never enters your nice, clean allocation model in the first place. This is what happens when the organization builds a cost governance program around the subscriptions we know about, then acts surprised when the bill includes things no one can explain. You can't allocate what you can't enumerate. You can't hold anyone accountable for a tenant you didn't know existed. And you definitely can't optimize a workload that finance can't even see as a workload. Shadow IT didn't die in the cloud. It evolved. In the data center era, Shadow IT had friction. Someone had to buy hardware, rack it, power it, hide it under a desk, or at least convince procurement to purchase something loud enough that IT would notice. The cost profile was visible. A big purchase, a project name, a contract, a depreciation schedule. Cloud removed that friction. Now a developer can swipe a card, spin up a subscription, create resources, and be billing in minutes. A business unit can buy a SaaS tool with an email address and call it a small experiment. A team can start a trial, forget to cancel, and convert to paid. And because the charges are often small at the line item level, they evade the immune system of finance. This is the uncomfortable truth. Finance processes are tuned to catch large anomalies, not thousands of micro subscriptions. That's why Shadow Cloud thrives. It hides in the long tail. And in Microsoft ecosystem specifically, there are a few common pathways. Azure, a dev sandbox subscription created with a personal Microsoft account or with a temporary project tenant that never got decommissioned. A subscription created under a separate billing relationship then peered into your network because we needed access. A proof of concept that quietly became production because it worked and nobody wanted to replatform it. You can call it agility. The invoice calls it recurring spend. Microsoft 365, trial tenants, add-on SKUs purchased by departments, Power Platform environments created with minimal oversight, Fabric capacities spun up to test something real quick. These are especially dangerous because they look like business tooling, not infrastructure, so they bypass the instinctive controls architects built for Azure subscriptions. And then there's the procurement angle. SaaS bought outside IT because IT had a backlog, or because someone wanted a feature now, or because vendor marketing convinced a business leader that it's just a monthly subscription. Those small monthly subscriptions don't trigger a finance escalation. They accumulate, and what they accumulate into is governance collapse. Because once spend exists outside your known graph, the organization loses two things at the same time: cost allocation and security posture. That distinction matters. When the spend is outside your graph, you don't just lose reporting accuracy. You lose control of identity, data boundaries, retention, and audit. You lose your ability to apply the same policies, cost center tags, allowed regions, approved SKUs, because those policies don't reach what you can't see. So you end up with parallel clouds, the governed one and the actual one. And the actual one is always bigger than you think. This is also where Showback becomes actively misleading. Your dashboards might show you every dollar in your enterprise enrollment and still be wrong, because the largest risks often aren't in the biggest subscriptions. They're in the unowned ones, the ones with no tagging, the ones with a vague name like Innovation Lab or Project X and no corresponding owner in the org chart. The real risk is not that someone spent money. The risk is that someone created a financial and security surface area with no accountability. So the governance consequence is predictable. Cost allocation collapses into unallocated spend and arguments, while security posture fragments into exceptions and blind spots. Then leadership asks for better Showback, and the organization obediently improves reporting on the part of the system it already knew about. This is how the trap reinforces itself. The fix is not to hunt for shadow subscriptions manually every month. That's just another form of heroics. The fix is to make enumeration a first-class governance capability, define what approved cloud means, define how new tenants and subscriptions get created, and treat unknown spend like an incident. Not because you're trying to be controlling, but because you're trying to operate a system that remains coherent. Because once spend escapes the graph, governance is no longer a design problem. It becomes a detective story, and that's when you lose. Now, with the failure modes mapped, the pattern is obvious. Governance isn't documentation, it's enforced intent. Governance is not documentation, it's enforced intent. So here's the pivot that most organizations refuse to make. Governance is not the document you publish. Governance is what the platform will and will not allow. The PDF is theater. The control plane is real. Most FinOps governance programs start as documentation because documentation is politically cheap. It doesn't force trade-offs. It doesn't break deployments. It doesn't require a fight with a business unit that wants an exception. It's just words that make leadership feel like the problem is being handled. But the cloud does not read your policy wiki. Azure does not care that your standard says required tags. It will happily accept an untagged resource forever. Microsoft 365 does not care that your licensing guide says no unapproved add-ons. It will happily let someone buy the thing you discover 3 months later. In other words, governance is control of starting conditions, not review of outcomes. That distinction matters. A Showback dashboard is an outcome report. It's a picture of decisions you already allowed. Real governance designs the conditions under which decisions can be made, and it forces renewal when the conditions drift. So reframe governance as a set of enforced outputs. Constraints: what can't be deployed, where, by whom, and under what metadata requirements. Workflows: what happens when spend deviates, who must respond, and what closure looks like. Escalation paths: what happens when a team can't or won't act inside the response window. Auditability: evidence that a human-approved risk, accepted variance, or requested an exception that later expired. If you don't have those four, you do not have governance, you have a set of preferences, and preferences don't survive scale. This is the uncomfortable truth. Guidelines are optional by design. If you call something a guideline, you have already decided the platform must tolerate non-compliance. You have already decided that delivery speed outranks cost discipline. That can be an intentional choice, but then stop calling it governance. Good governance is deterministic, not aspirational. It creates a predictable system where a deployment either passes the guardrails or it doesn't. And when it doesn't, there is an explicit lane for exceptions that is slower, more visible, and time-bound. Not punitive, just real. Because the purpose of governance isn't to stop work, it's to stop unowned work from becoming permanent spend. So what does good look like in this context? It looks like a deterministic security model, but for cost. And yes, it's the same pattern security teams learned the hard way. You don't secure an enterprise by emailing people best practices. You secure it by making insecure behavior difficult, visible, and expensive to maintain. FinOps is the same. It's risk management, not cost cutting. Cost cutting is a one-time story. You found waste, you removed it, you declared victory, the system drifted back, and now you're doing the same exercise again next quarter. Risk management is an operating model. You accept that spend volatility, orphaned assets, and exceptions are risks that must be continuously constrained. You don't aim for zero spend, you aim for spend with intent. And intent has to be encoded. This is also why the central FinOps team model fails. A central team can define standards and build tooling, but it cannot own every decision. The moment it tries, it becomes a bottleneck, and the organization roots around it. Then you get shadow subscriptions. Then you get exceptions by email. Then you're back in the trap, just with more meetings. Governance has to be distributed but enforced centrally. Central defines the invariants, tagging requirements, allowed regions, approval workflows, budget escalation contracts. Distributed owners make the decisions inside those invariants. They choose sizes, architectures, licensing, retention, and performance trade-offs. And when distributed owners want to violate the invariants, they can. But only through an exception lane that creates evidence, enforces expiry, and forces renewal. That's the single governance decision that prevents most drift. Exceptions expire by default, because an exception without expiry is not an exception. It's a new baseline. Once you accept that governance is enforced intent, the rest of the episode gets practical. You need a minimum viable governance stack that can constrain creation, detect variance, and force closure, not more reporting, a system of action. The three enforceable systems of action. So what replaces Showback theater? Not better dashboards, not more FinOps meetings, not another spreadsheet where someone promises to follow up. A system of action is three enforceable systems working together: guardrails, alarms, and actuation. Each one solves a different failure mode. And if you skip one, the whole thing collapses back into email and hope. First, guardrails. In Azure, the cleanest expression of a guardrail is Azure policy. Not because policy is special, but because it sits at the creation boundary. It can shape starting conditions. That's the only place governance scales. Azure policy is the constraint engine. It's where the organization encodes invariants, required tags, allowed regions, allowed SKUs, maybe required diagnostic settings, maybe required resource locks for certain classes of assets, not as recommendations, but as rules that actually evaluate and enforce. And yes, there's a discipline to it. Start in audit mode to observe blast radius, then move to deny where you can. Use modify and deploy if not exists, where you need the platform to correct things automatically. But conceptually, this is the point. You are not asking people to remember to do the right thing. You are making the wrong thing harder to do. Second, alarms. This is where Azure cost management budgets and alerts come in. Most organizations treat budgets as a finance artifact. That's adorable. Budgets are an operational contract. And a budget says when spend crosses this threshold, a specific owner is paged within a specific time window with a specific escalation path if there is no response. And that's not finance, that's incident response, but for money. And budgets aren't only about over budget. They're about volatility. They're about detecting that the system is behaving differently than expected, early enough that you can still change course. So budgets and anomaly alerts are the alarm system. They don't fix anything by themselves. They generate events, and events are useless unless they route to a human who is obligated to respond. Which brings us to the third system, actuation. This is the part Showback never had. This is the actuator the observer pattern was missing. Actuation is workflow automation, power automate, service now. Whatever ITSM or orchestration layer your enterprise already uses. The tool choice is secondary. The pattern is non-negotiable. A cost anomaly is not an email. It is a work item with an owner, an SLA, required decision states, and closure evidence. This is where the system stops being polite, because a workflow can enforce the things humans won't: assignment, escalation, approvals, expiry dates, and audit trails. It can also trigger remediation actions when the decision is already defined, like auto-tagging, stopping dev compute out of hours, or quarantining unowned resources. Now here's the architectural pattern language that ties all three together. Event, reasoning, orchestration. Event: something changed. Spend spiked. A budget threshold crossed. A policy violation occurred. An untagged resource appeared. A new subscription was created outside the approved process. Reasoning: what does the organization want to do about that class of event? Is this acceptable? Is it expected? Is it an exception? Is it a violation? Is it orphaned? Is it shared? Orchestration: do the thing, assign it, approve it, fix it, quarantine it, escalate it, record the decision. When people ask, what should we implement first? And the answer is not cost management or policy or service now. The answer is implement a closed loop. If you only implement guardrails, teams will route around them and you'll get shadow subscriptions. If you only implement alarms, alerts will die in inboxes. If you only implement workflows, you'll drown in tickets because you didn't reduce the decision volume at creation time. The three systems reduce different kinds of entropy. Guardrails reduce bad creation, alarms reduce detection latency, and actuation reduces closure failure. And there's one more uncomfortable truth buried in this: tools don't matter without ownership design. You can implement the cleanest Azure policy initiative on earth. If the owner tag points to a distribution list, your actuator still doesn't know who to assign the ticket to. You can set budgets everywhere. If the alerts go to a shared mailbox, nobody feels compelled to respond. So the system of action has to be wired to real ownership. That's why the next dependency is identity, not cost. Before you can govern spend, you need to know who can say no, who can approve variance, and who can accept risk. Ownership is the root control plane. Everything else is just instrumentation. Ownership as a control plane, the who can say no problem. Ownership is the part everyone agrees with in principle, then quietly sabotages in implementation. Because real ownership creates friction. Real ownership means someone can say, no, you don't get to deploy that. Or yes, you can keep that spend, but you're accepting it on record. And most organizations don't actually want that kind of clarity. They want shared accountability, which is just a polite term for unassigned responsibility. So here's the definition that matters. An owner is an accountable person or team that can approve, spend, and accept risk. Not a distribution list. Not the cloud team, not FinOps, not IT. A named owner is a control surface. It's the routing table for every cost event you claim you want to manage. And the moment you don't have it, the system falls back to chaos. Alerts go nowhere, exceptions get approved by whoever is available, and spend becomes shared the way technical debt becomes shared. Everyone benefits, no one pays. That's the who can say no problem. FinOps programs collapse because they assume that if they assign a cost to a team, that team can act. But can act is an authorization problem. If the people receiving the showback don't have the rights, the time, or the mandate to change anything, you just created an inbox ritual. So ownership isn't a label, it's an authority model. And the scope matters. At enterprise scale, you typically need ownership at 3 layers, and the mistake is pretending one layer covers all of them. First, subscription or tenant ownership. Someone owns the boundary. They decide who can create resources, which policies apply, which budgets exist, and what the default guardrails are. If no one owns the boundary, then any workload can bring its own rules, and now you're running a multi-cloud inside one cloud. Second, workload or product ownership. Someone owns the actual system that spends money. The subscription might be shared, but the workload cannot be. If a product team can't name a workload owner, what they actually have is a collection of resources with no lifecycle. That's not a product, that's a liability. Third, shared platform ownership. Networking, identity, logging, security tooling, CI/CD runners, shared databases, integration layers, these are legitimate shared costs, but they still require an owner who can set allocation rules and enforce consumption constraints. Otherwise, shared services becomes the permanent excuse for ungovernable spend. Now here's the rule that makes ownership real. Every resource must map to an owner at creation time, not at month end, not when finance asks, not after a cost spike. Creation time is the only point where the platform still has leverage. After that, resources become politically protected. It's running production. We can't touch it. We'll fix it next sprint. You know the script. So if you want accountability, you enforce ownership as a precondition for existence. That sounds harsh until you remember the alternative. Paying indefinitely for things nobody will claim. This is also why the central FinOps team owns everything. Anti-pattern is so persistent and so destructive. It feels efficient. One team, one model, one dashboard, one place to ask questions. But architecturally, it creates 2 outcomes. First, it creates a bottleneck. Every decision queues behind the same team, therefore teams route around it. Second, it creates abdication. Product teams stop thinking about cost because FinOps owns that. Then when something goes wrong, they blame the FinOps team for not catching it sooner. Meanwhile, the FinOps team never had the authority to prevent the decision in the first place. So the correct pattern is federated ownership with centralized enforcement. Central defines the invariance and the exception lane. Distributed owners operate inside those invariants and carry the consequences. Now, none of this works unless ownership can be exercised. Owners must have the ability to approve, spend changes, and the ability to accept risk explicitly. That means they need clear levers, budgets they control, tags that map spend to them, and workflows that force them to decide. If ownership exists only on paper, you didn't build a control plane. You built a phone tree, and this is where the system gets uncomfortable. Fast. Ownership means someone will be blamed. Good. Blame is not the goal, but consequence is, because without consequence, Showback stays what it always was. High-resolution awareness with zero obligation. So the next step is mechanical. You take ownership and you encode it as metadata, not for reporting, for enforcement. That means tags, mandatory at deployment time, mandatory tagging at deployment time, cost center plus owner as non-negotiable metadata. Once ownership exists as a concept, it has to become computable. Otherwise, it's just a slide in a governance deck. That's what mandatory tagging really is, turning who owns this into something the platform can evaluate, route, and enforce. Not next month, not after a variance meeting, at creation time. Most organizations treat tags like decoration. Cost center, owner, environment, workload, nice to have, useful for reporting, maybe a KPI for tag compliance. That framing is why it fails. Tags are allocation primitives. They are the join keys between three different worlds that never naturally agree: cloud resources, finance budgets, and human accountability. If the join keys are missing, your entire operating model becomes guesswork, and guesswork is the root cause of cost theater. So the minimum viable tag set is boring on purpose. Cost center and owner are non-negotiable. Environment and workload or app usually come next, because prod and dev behave differently, and because you need to group spend into something meaningful. But the critical part isn't the list, it's when and how they get applied. Manual tagging is an entropy generator. If you ask people to remember to tag, they won't. Not because they're careless, but because the system rewards speed. Tagging happens at the end of a deployment, under time pressure, right after someone finally got a pipeline working. That's the moment your governance depends on voluntary discipline. It will decay. So tagging has to move left, deployment time, and it has to be enforced. Deny, modify, or deploy if not exists, depending on what you're controlling. The exact mechanism is less important than the architectural principle. If a resource cannot be mapped to an owner and a cost center, it should not exist. That sounds extreme until you observe the alternative. A growing inventory of anonymous spend that no one will delete, no one will right size, and no one can justify. You can't hold people accountable for costs you can't attribute reliably, and you can't attribute reliably if the attribution is optional. Now, the next predictable objection is shared services. We can't tag those to one cost center. Correct. That's why shared services need an allocation model that's explicit, stable, and revisited. The goal isn't to pretend shared costs aren't shared. The goal is to prevent shared from becoming unowned. A platform subscription can still have an owner. The platform team can still have a cost center. And you can still build a split charge model, a platform tax, consumption-based allocation, or a fixed rate. Pick your poison. The point is to pick it deliberately and enforce the metadata that makes it possible. Because shared services are where accountability goes to die, not due to malice, due to ambiguity. And ambiguity always wins unless you remove it. This is also where people make the second foundational mistake. They aim for perfect tagging instead of enforceable tagging. Perfect tagging is a fantasy. Enforceable tagging is a system. Enforceable tagging accepts that tags will be wrong sometimes. Owners change, cost centers get renamed, workloads get split, that's fine. But enforceable tagging makes the drift visible and correctable because every resource has to carry an identity for who is responsible today. And when that identity becomes stale, it becomes a life cycle event, not a surprise. So you design for that reality. Tags must be validated, not just present. Owner tags should map to real identities, not free text. Cost centers should be from a controlled set, not whatever someone typed at 2 a.m. If you allow arbitrary values, you just move the argument from who owns this cost to what did you mean by this tag value? It's the same dysfunction with better formatting. And no, this is not a FinOps team project alone. This is an identity and governance project because the metadata has to be authoritative enough to drive automation. If the tags can't be trusted, you can't route tickets, you can't escalate budgets, you can't quarantine resources safely. You're back to manual investigation. So tagging becomes a control surface. It enables guardrails, alarms, and actuation. Guardrails use tags to decide what can be deployed and where. Alarms use tags to decide who gets paged. Actuation uses tags to decide who gets assigned, who approves, and who gets blamed when an exception expires. This is why the phrase tagging strategy is misleading. A strategy is optional. This is a contract. And here's the irony. Once you enforce tagging at deployment time, Showback actually becomes useful because now your visibility is attached to an accountable owner by design, not by spreadsheet inference. You can route costs to decisions, not just to teams in theory. That's when the dashboard stops being wallpaper and starts being evidence. Azure policy as a cost guardrail engine, not a compliance checkbox. Once tagging becomes a contract, you need something that enforces the contract when people are moving fast. That's Azure policy. And no, Azure policy is not a compliance feature. That's the framing that kills it. Compliance is usually audit after the fact. Azure policy is valuable when it is precondition enforcement. It shapes what can exist. So treat policy as a cost guardrail engine, a distributed decision compiler that evaluates deployments against your invariants and either allows them, fixes them, or blocks them. This is the part where most organizations sabotage themselves. They deploy policy in audit mode, generate a beautiful compliance dashboard, and then stop. Audit mode is not governance. Audit mode is reconnaissance. Reconnaissance is useful. Reconnaissance is not control. Azure policy has a set of effects, and you don't need the full taxonomy to understand the architecture. You need the intent behind them. Deny is the deterministic one. It refuses the deployment. That is what turns guidance into constraint. When a resource requires an owner and cost center tag, deny makes missing metadata impossible. When a region is disallowed, deny prevents the cost and data gravity of the wrong geography from ever happening. Audit is evidence. It tells you what would have violated the rule, and that's how you measure blast radius before you tighten enforcement. Modify is the most underrated. It autocorrects. It's how you reduce human friction while still enforcing your invariants. If you can derive a tag from context, modify can apply it. If you can normalize tag casing or standard values, modify can remove the "we typed it differently" excuse. Deploy, if not exists, is how you force baseline hygiene into the environment. Diagnostic settings, resource locks, maybe configuration that makes the cost surface observable enough to govern. Now, the guardrails that matter for cost are not exotic. They're boring, and that's why they work. Require tags, enforce allowed locations, enforce allowed SKUs for specific classes of workloads, restrict premium tiers in non-production, block creation of certain resource types in the wrong scope, require shutdown schedules or automation hooks for dev/test where you can. This is not about being draconian. It's about removing the default ability to make expensive decisions by accident. Because most cloud waste isn't malicious. It's just the platform's permissive defaults meeting human urgency. Here's the discipline that prevents self-inflicted outages. Audit first. If you flip deny on day one at the wrong scope, you will break someone's pipeline and they will root around you for the next 2 years. That's not a joke. That's how shadow subscriptions get born. So start in audit mode to observe. Measure how many things would fail. Fix the obvious gaps. Build the exception lane. Then move to deny where the organization has agreed that the invariant is real. And scope is where this becomes architectural. If you apply policy at a management group, you're defining org-level invariants, the rules that should not vary. Required tags, allowed regions, baseline security and logging. That's a reasonable place to put "you must be attributable to an owner." If you apply policy at subscription scope, you're defining environment-level constraints. Dev subscriptions can be tighter, production subscriptions can be stricter on change paths, platform subscriptions can have different allowed resources. If you apply policy at resource group scope, you're doing workload-level tailoring, which is useful, but it is also where exceptions silently multiply. Be careful. Every special case at lower scope is an entropy generator unless it is tracked and time-bound. And here's the key point that has to stand on its own. A policy without enforcement is a wish list. You can call it a standard, you can call it governance, you can put it in a wiki. The platform will still happily let people violate it, and then Showback will report the violation after you've already paid for it. This is also why Azure policy doesn't replace budgets or workflows. It reduces decision volume by blocking known bad starting conditions. It prevents whole classes of waste from ever entering the estate. But it won't catch everything. It can't tell you whether a workload is worth it. It can't decide that a spike is legitimate. It can't negotiate trade-offs between performance and cost. That's where alarms and actuation come next. Policy defines the boundaries of acceptable behavior. Budgets detect drift inside the boundaries. Workflows force a human decision when the drift matters. So if your current FinOps story is "we have a tagging policy and a dashboard," you are missing the only part that scales. The refusal, because until the platform can say no, you're not running guardrails. You're running polite suggestions at cloud speed. Budgets as escalation contracts. Alerts with teeth. Now budgets. This is where most organizations accidentally reveal they never wanted accountability in the first place. They treat budgets like a finance document, a number someone set during planning season, then ignored until month end, then explained away. And Azure Cost Management happily supports that pattern because it can generate a nice alert email and call it governance. But budgets aren't a reporting feature. They're an escalation contract. A budget is the organization saying, if spend crosses this line, someone must respond in a defined time window with a defined set of options and a defined escalation path if they don't. That's not accounting, that's incident management. The reason this matters is simple. Showback fails because it creates awareness with no consequence. Budgets are how you attach consequence to variance without needing a heroic FinOps analyst to chase every anomaly. So the first design rule is non-negotiable. Budgets must be tied to ownership. If your budget alert goes to a shared mailbox, you don't have an alert, you have spam. If your budget alert goes to a FinOps distribution list, you don't have accountability, you have outsourced guilt. The alert has to hit the person or team that can actually change the system. The workload owner, the subscription owner, or the platform owner, depending on what you're budgeting. And it has to be explicit which one it is, because otherwise everyone assumes it's someone else. Second rule, budgets are not only for over budget. The goal isn't a zero variance fantasy. The goal is reduced volatility and faster detection of drift. Variance is a signal that either the system behavior changed or your assumptions changed. Either way, it requires a decision. So the budget thresholds need to be staged, early warning, action required, escalation, not because you enjoy bureaucracy, but because humans ignore binary alarms. They need time to react before you hit the wall. A practical pattern is notify at 50% and 75%, require response at 90% and escalate at 100%. The exact numbers don't matter. The existence of a ladder does, because an escalation ladder is what turns we noticed into we did something. And the ladder should be explicit. Team owner first, then platform owner, then finance partner, then exec sponsor. It's not about shaming, it's about ensuring the decision reaches someone with the authority to accept risk or reforecast. That last part matters more than people admit. Most organizations act like the only acceptable response to a budget breach is optimize. No. There are 4 legitimate response types, and the system needs to allow all of them, or people will lie. Acknowledge, yes, this is expected, and here's why. Mitigate, yes, this is unplanned, and here's what we will change, by when. Request exception, yes, we need to violate the budget temporarily, and here's the justification, scope, and expiry. Reforecast, yes, the budget was wrong because the business changed, and we're updating the plan with an accountable approver. If you only allow mitigate, teams will invent narratives to avoid escalation. If you allow all 4, you get truth. And governance runs on truth, not optimism. Now here's the part people get wrong. They think the budget is the control. It isn't. The budget is the trigger that creates a decision moment. Without a required workflow, budget alerts die like every other email. People see them, mentally file them under later, and then later becomes the invoice. So a budget without routing and SLA is just another observer with no actuator. This is why the budget has to create work, not conversation. Work. A cost alert should open a ticket, assign it to an owner, set a response timer, and require closure evidence. If the organization won't do that, then stop pretending budgets are governance. They're just notifications, and budgets need to be designed with the right metric focus. Most teams obsess over absolute spend. That's fine for finance optics. Operationally, volatility is the killer. Volatility means you can't plan. Volatility means surprise. Volatility means rushed decisions under pressure. So the budget system should aim to shrink the amplitude of surprises. Fewer spikes, faster response, less orphaned noise, fewer unallocated charges. When that works, savings show up as a side effect, not the headline. Because the real win isn't, we saved money this month. The real win is, spend became predictable, attributable, and intentional. And once you have that, you can actually make trade-offs like adults. Now the next problem is obvious. Even with budgets and escalation, alerts still die unless the organization has a real actuator. So the missing piece is workflow automation, the part that forces closure and leaves evidence behind. Workflow automation as the missing actuator. Now you need the actuator. Because guardrails prevent some bad creation and budgets detect drift, but neither one forces a human decision to finish. Without actuation, alerts become background noise, and we'll look at it becomes the organization's primary control mechanism. That is not a mechanism. Workflow automation is the missing piece because it turns a cost signal into an owned work item with consequences. And yes, that means you have to treat cost anomalies like incidents. Not because money is more important than uptime, but because unmanaged spend is still a production problem. It drains budget, increases risk, and forces bad decisions later under pressure. So the mental model is simple. An anomaly is not an email. An anomaly is an incident record. It has an owner, it has an SLA, it has a required outcome, and it has closure evidence. If you can't produce evidence, you didn't govern it, you observed it. This is where ServiceNow or your ITSM platform earns its keep. Not as a ticketing system, as an accountability compiler. It takes a fuzzy event, cost is up, and forces it through a deterministic process. Assignment, triage, decision, remediation, and closure. Power Automate can play the same role if you don't have a full ITSM estate. The platform choice doesn't matter, the behavior does. Here's what the workflow has to contain, or it will decay into theater again. First, a consistent object model. A ticket with fields that matter. Scope, subscription, management group, workload, affected service, cost delta, forecast impact, and the owner derived from authoritative metadata. Not someone decide who owns it. The system decides based on tags and subscription ownership. Second, a response contract. The ticket must require a response type. The same four options you defined for budgets: acknowledge, mitigate, request exception, or reforecast. Those aren't just words. Each option should drive the next step automatically. Acknowledge means you attach a rationale and an approver, and the system records it. Mitigate means you attach an action plan and due date, and the system follows up until it's done. Request exception means you enter the exception workflow, not an email thread. Reforecast means finance gets pulled in with a named sponsor who accepts the new number. Third, assignment and escalation. If the owner doesn't respond in the window, the system escalates, not because you enjoy escalation. Because delayed decisions are still decisions. They are just decisions made by default by the platform via continued billing. Now, the exception workflow is where most organizations fall apart, so it needs to be explicit. An exception request is not "please let me." It's a structured record with required fields: business justification, blast radius, start date, end date, and what the team will do to exit the exception. And the important part, expiry is enforced. If the exception hits its end date, the system either renews it with approval or it triggers remediation. No silent continuation. No, we forgot. That one constraint, expiry enforced by workflow, removes more drift than any dashboard you will ever build. Now, where does automation end and humans begin? Humans set intent. Systems execute repeatable steps. If the remediation is deterministic and safe, automate it. If it requires judgment about availability risk, route it for approval. That's the boundary. So, for example, auto-tagging missing metadata via policy modify is safe. Quarantining an unowned dev VM by shutting it down outside business hours can be safe if your organization agreed to that policy. Deleting resources is rarely safe without an approval lane, but moving them into a restricted holding state often is. The point is to define tiers of action. Notify only where the ticket exists and someone must respond. Autocorrect where the platform can fix metadata or configuration. Autostop or restrict where the platform can reduce burn while waiting for a human decision. And only then delete with explicit approvals and evidence. This is what makes the workflow an actuator instead of a bureaucratic museum. It changes reality, it reduces spend while the human process catches up, and it prevents the most common anti-pattern: email finance. Email is not a workflow. Email has no ownership, no SLA, no audit trail, and no forced closure. It is exactly the kind of soft control that Showback trains organizations to rely on. The final piece is the uncomfortable one. Workflows surface who is allowed to say no. If every anomaly ticket ends with "we can't do anything," you didn't build automation. You built a complaint routing system. Ownership has to include authority, or the workflow becomes cruelty. Tickets assigned to people who can't change the bill. So workflow automation is not the nice-to-have layer. It is the actuator that turns governance from observation into enforcement. And once you have an actuator, you can start doing the thing organizations avoid: remediation and quarantine for nobody's problem spend. Automatic remediation and quarantine. Stop paying for nobody's problem. Once you have a workflow, you're tempted to stop there. Tickets, SLAs, approvals, evidence, everyone feels safer. And you're still bleeding money. Because a ticket doesn't change reality unless the platform takes some form of action. What Showback trains organizations to do is tolerate drift while they investigate. Investigation is fine for root cause. It is not a control strategy. So you need remediation and quarantine. Not as a heroic cleanup project, as a default operating behavior for spend with no owner. Start with a definition that the platform can evaluate. Orphaned and unowned are not vibes, they are states. Unowned means the resource has no owner tag, the tag points to something non-routable like a distribution list, or the owner identity no longer exists. Stale ownership is unowned. If the system can't page a human, it's orphaned from a governance perspective. Orphaned also means unattached disks, unused public IPs, zombie snapshots, abandoned test databases, stopped compute that still incurs storage, or anything that exists without a workload lifecycle. These are not small inefficiencies. They are scheduled spend. Now, quarantine is the architectural middle ground between doing nothing and deleting production. Most organizations avoid remediation because they're afraid of breaking things. Reasonable. They also avoid quarantine because they think it sounds punitive. Fine, keep paying forever then. Quarantine is simply this: isolate, restrict, notify, expire. Isolate means you move the resource into a known policy boundary. Maybe that's a dedicated resource group with restrictive policies. Maybe it's a subscription with limited networking. The point is to stop it from continuing to create blast radius while you figure out what it is. Restrict means you reduce its ability to burn money, shut down compute where safe, disable autoscale, remove public exposure, block new deployments into that scope, put the resource behind guardrails that make continuing drift harder. Notify means the system still tries to find a human. Tag owners, subscription owners, platform owners, finance partners. You give the organization a chance to claim the asset. Expire means the quarantine has a timer. If no one claims it, it doesn't become the new normal. It gets stopped, archived, or deleted based on the class of resource and the risk tolerance you defined. This is the core psychological shift. People respond to deadlines, not dashboards. Now you need remediation tiers because not every action should be automatic. Tier 1 is notify only. The system flags the resource as unowned, opens the ticket, and starts the clock. That's where you begin if you don't trust your inventory. Tier 2 is autocorrect. The platform fixes what it can safely fix. Apply missing tags via policy modify when the tag can be derived from context. Attach diagnostic settings. Enforce a shutdown schedule on dev test that opted into the program. These are low-risk, high-return actions. Tier 3 is auto-stop or throttle. Shut down VMs in non-production outside business hours when they're unowned. Pause fabric capacities that were created as experiments and never tagged. Disable scheduled jobs that are running with no accountable owner. This is where you stop the financial bleeding while still allowing recovery. Tier 4 is delete. And delete must be gated: approval, retention, evidence, and usually a recovery path like backups. Deleting without a governance lane is how you create a new shadow cloud. Teams will recreate the system elsewhere, quieter. The trade-off is always cost risk versus availability risk, and governance exists to make that trade-off explicit, not accidental. If leadership says we will never shut anything down automatically, what they just said is we accept paying indefinitely for whatever the platform allows. That is a choice. Own it, but don't call it FinOps governance. This is also how you measure progress without lying to yourself. Don't measure savings. Savings are easy to game, and they don't prove control. Measure often inventory over time. If the number of unowned resources is shrinking, you're enforcing ownership. Measure MTTR on anomalies. If anomalies close faster, your actuator works. Measure how many resources hit quarantine and then get claimed versus deleted. That ratio tells you whether your tagging and ownership model is real or whether your environment is full of abandoned assets nobody wants to admit exist. And yes, this feels like security. That's not an accident. Cost governance is the same pattern. Define acceptable states, detect violations, respond with predictable actions, and require explicit acceptance when you're taking risk. Once quarantine exists, exceptions stop being special. They become a controlled mechanism to keep something alive with an owner and a timer. That's the only way you stop paying for nobody's problem at scale. Time-bound exception management, expiry dates, or it isn't real governance. Now take quarantine and remediation and aim it at the most politically protected object in the enterprise, the exception. Because if you don't make exceptions time-bound, you just built a very efficient way to formalize bypasses. You didn't reduce entropy, you industrialized it. Time-bound exception management is not paperwork, it is a life cycle. Request, approve, enforce constraints, expire, review. And every word in that sequence matters. Request means the team can't self-declare an exception by doing the thing and then writing the justification later. The system has to catch the violation before it becomes production, because production status is how exceptions become permanent. The request has to happen in a lane that is slower than the compliant path. That is the incentive model. Approve means a named approver accepts the trade-off on record, not a committee, not the cloud team, a person with budget authority or risk authority, someone who can be asked later, why did we allow this, and can answer without blaming the tool. Enforce constraints means the exception doesn't remove guardrails, it relocates them. A good exception does not turn policy off. It turns policy into a scoped, monitored allowance. Maybe you allow a region for a specific workload for a specific time. Maybe you allow a premium SKU for a specific migration window. But the exception should still require tagging, still route alerts to the owner, still generate anomaly events, still live inside the budget model. An exception that disables observability is not an exception. It is a blind spot. Expire is the point most organizations refuse to implement because it forces a second decision. They'd rather approve once and never think about it again. But governance exists to force renewal when conditions change. The purpose of expiry is not to be mean. The purpose of expiry is to prevent temporary from becoming baseline. So the end date is not optional, and it has to be enforced by the platform, not we'll review quarterly, not we'll put it on the calendar. If the system doesn't trigger renewal or remediation automatically, you're back to hoping a human remembers. Review is where you close the loop. When an exception expires, the organization should answer one of three questions. Did we remove the need? Did we renew intentionally? Or did we learn the policy is wrong? This is the part people miss. Exception management is how governance evolves without becoming dogma. Exceptions aren't only risk, they're signal. They tell you where the platform or the policy doesn't match reality. But you only get that signal if you force exceptions to surface again. Now the minimum required fields are boring. Good, boredom is stable. Owner, a routable identity, not a mailbox. Business justification, tied to an outcome, not we need it. Blast radius, what scope, what services, what data, what subscriptions, what tenants. End date, the expiry. And then the one field that turns this into real design. Exit criteria. What has to be true for this exception to die? A refactor completed, a migration finished, a feature gap closed, a contract renewed with the right SKU. Whatever it is, write it down. Because without exit criteria, the exception is just a permission slip for indefinite drift. Now you need a cadence that makes the system predictable, a sell-by-date discipline for policies and for exceptions, short enough that drift can't hide, long enough that teams can actually execute. And the system should track the age distribution. How many exceptions are under 30 days, under 90 days, over 180 days? If you have a long tail of ancient exceptions, you don't have governance. You have historical artifacts. This is why deadlines beat dashboards. Dashboards invite interpretation. Deadlines force decisions. And this is also where you measure maturity in a way that can't be faked. Exception volume, exception age, renewal rate versus closure rate, time to expire, time to remediate after expiry. When those numbers improve, it means your organization is reducing ambiguity, not just producing reports. So the rule is simple and absolute. If an exception does not expire, it is not an exception. It is a new baseline you were too polite to name. And once you accept that, the Showback Trap loses its favorite hiding place. The email thread labeled approved. Microsoft 365 Showback, licenses, adoption, and the shelfware factory. Now take everything we just said about Azure cost governance and apply it to Microsoft 365, where the spend looks simple right up until you audit it. Because M365 Showback has its own trap, licensing feels like a fixed cost, so people assume it's inherently governable. It isn't. It's just a different kind of drift. In Azure, waste often looks like orphaned resources and missized compute. In Microsoft 365, waste looks like shelfware, licenses assigned just in case, add-ons bought during a crisis, and premium SKUs that nobody can justify after the renewal email arrives. And Showback makes it worse because it turns the problem into a report. We sent departments a license utilization dashboard. Great. Now what? This is the foundational mismatch. In M365, the unit of accountability is rarely the IT admin. It's the product owner, the business owner, the department head who requested the capability, got the budget approved, and then delegated ongoing ownership to IT, which is the most reliable way to manufacture permanent spend. Licenses don't manage themselves. Entitlements don't decay gracefully. They accumulate because Microsoft 365 is designed to be easy to adopt and hard to unwind. That's not a complaint. That's how platforms scale. So if your governance model is we'll review licenses quarterly, you're not governing. You're observing drift on a delay. The cost drivers here are boring but relentless. Base licenses, add-ons, premium security SKUs, audio conferencing, Power BI variants, Fabric capacity, Power Platform per user and per app licensing, storage overages, archived data, retention policies that were set during one legal scare and never revisited. And the more your organization buys, the more you lose the ability to answer a basic question. Who owns the decision that created this recurring charge? Most organizations can't answer that because they treat licensing as procurement, not as an operating model. So Showback becomes a monthly shame report. Here are the top departments with unused licenses. And the departments shrug because nothing forces a decision. No owner, no SLA, no expiry, no quarantine. So the licenses stay assigned because removing access is politically harder than paying, and the platform happily bills you forever. This is where the shelfware factory becomes systemic. Joiners arrive and get assigned the full bundle because it's easier than thinking. Movers change roles and keep their old entitlements because no one wants to break workflows. Leavers depart and their accounts get disabled, but their licenses don't get reclaimed quickly because identity offboarding and license harvesting aren't wired together as a deterministic process. And yes, every organization claims they do, joiner, mover, leaver. They do not. They do disable account. That's not the same thing. So the governance moves here are the same pattern as Azure, just applied to entitlements. First, entitlement reviews as a forced workflow, not a survey. A product owner should have to attest these users need these licenses for these reasons, and we accept the budget impact. If they can't, licenses get reclaimed automatically after a grace period, not because you're saving pennies, because you're enforcing owned spend. Second, enforce role-based license assignment as much as you can and treat exceptions like exceptions. If a department wants a premium SKU for 3 people for a migration window, fine. Put it in the exception lane with an end date and a renewal requirement. Otherwise, you just created permanent premium spend for a temporary event. Third, reclaiming must be automatic. If reclaiming requires a human to remember, you already lost. This is where workflow automation matters again. Identity events should trigger license changes, and licenses should have an owner tag equivalent. If you can't route who owns this license spend, you can't govern it. And fourth, your Showback metrics need to be honest, not licenses purchased, not licenses assigned. The metrics that matter are unused licenses, stale entitlements, time to reclaim after departure, and percentage of premium SKUs with an active business justification on record. Because if you don't measure reclaim time and justification coverage, you're measuring inventory, not accountability. Microsoft 365 cost looks flat until it isn't. Then you get hit with a renewal cliff, a security uplift, or an AI add-on wave. And leadership asks why FinOps didn't catch it. FinOps did catch it. It was in the dashboard. You just didn't have governance. And now the platform is shifting again. AI and usage-based services are turning fixed license spend into a probabilistic consumption model, which means the M365 Showback Trap becomes the same as the Azure one, just faster. AI multiplies governance failure, Copilot, Fabric, Power Platform consumption. Now add AI to this picture and watch the failure accelerate. Not because AI is uniquely evil, but because it changes the cost model from mostly steady state to probabilistic. And probabilistic spend destroys organizations that only know how to govern fixed budgets and month-end reports. Copilot is the cleanest example. It looks like a license. That makes everyone relax. Procurement buys a bundle, leadership declares AI transformation, and the bill feels predictable. Then reality shows up. Adoption is uneven, usage is unknown, and the value story becomes a vibe. Meanwhile, the licenses keep renewing because nobody wants to be the person who took AI away. So Copilot becomes shelfware with executive sponsorship, which is the most durable kind of waste. But the deeper problem is this. AI spend is not only the license. AI creates secondary spend, storage growth, data classification work, security controls, logging, and whatever downstream services get pulled into the new workflows. When people say Copilot is XRs per user, they're describing the smallest line item in the system they just unleashed. Fabric makes this worse because it pulls analytics spend into a capacity model that looks simple right until it isn't. A capacity gets provisioned, teams start building, and the organization learns a new lesson. Shared platforms are the easiest place to hide cost drift. If nobody owns the capacity, nobody owns the burn. And in a shared data platform, owner is not the admin who can click buttons. It's the product owner for the platform who can set allocation rules, define onboarding requirements, and deny access to teams that refuse attribution. If that owner doesn't exist, Fabric becomes a communal buffet with a single invoice. Power Platform is the Entropy factory nobody wants to admit they built. It starts as citizen development, which is another way of saying we're going to distribute software creation without distributing governance. Apps multiply, environments multiply, connectors get enabled, premium features get turned on temporarily, and then the monthly charges become background radiation. The system didn't break, the bill just got noisy. Here's the core claim. AI exposes governance gaps faster than infrastructure ever did. Traditional Azure waste often takes weeks to show up as a meaningful number. AI usage can spike in hours. A single misscoped process, a runaway flow, a misconfigured index, or a team hammering an endpoint can generate cost volatility that your monthly showback process will see after the money is gone. And the AI story amplifies the human failure mode. Teams treat experimentation as free. In the cloud, experimentation is never free. It's just unmetered in the engineer's brain. So governance has to shift from track spend to govern usage. That means you treat AI as a product, not a feature. Every AI capability needs an owner, a budget, and a defined purpose, not innovation. Purpose, a workload, a business outcome, something you can kill if it doesn't perform, because if you don't, AI becomes a universal exception. We needed it for AI, becomes the justification for every bypass, extra capacity, premium licenses, new tenants, new environments, new connectors, and of course, data copied into places it shouldn't be. Cost and security drift together here. They are the same drift, just priced differently. And this is where Microsoft's own messaging accidentally proves the point. The Ignite narrative around agentic operations is move instantly from visibility to action. That only works if action is allowed, owned, and constrained. An optimization agent can suggest resizing a VM and even generate the script. Great. Who approves it? Who owns the risk if performance degrades? What's the exception lane when the workload has a legitimate reason to stay oversized? If you can't answer those questions, you don't have agentic FinOps. You have faster recommendations going nowhere. AI doesn't fix governance. AI punishes the absence of it. So the leadership move is not buy more tools. The move is to harden the system of action, guardrails that constrain sprawl, budgets that trigger response, and workflows that force a decision with expiry dates. Because AI spend doesn't drift politely. It spikes, it spreads, and then it gets defended as strategic. And once it's defended as strategic, it becomes untouchable. That's the trap, upgraded for 2026. Showback tells you what happened, and AI ensures it happens faster than your organization can argue about it. From cost control to value-driven cloud financial management. At this point, some people will hear all of this and conclude, so the goal is cost control. No, cost control is the entry fee. It's not the outcome. The real outcome is value-driven cloud financial management. Spend that is intentional, attributable, and tied to something the business can defend without hand-waving. Because if the only story your organization can tell is, we reduced spend, You will eventually optimize yourself into irrelevance. You'll starve platforms, delay modernization, and turn governance into a veto machine. That's not FinOps, that's austerity with better tagging. This is the uncomfortable truth. The cloud is a variable cost execution engine. It will happily turn unclear priorities into unpredictable invoices. Therefore, governance isn't about saving money, it's about encoding priorities into the operating model, so spend follows strategy by default, and that distinction matters. Value-driven management starts with a value lens that isn't fake. Not digital transformation, not innovation. A value lens means unit economics and service outcomes. Cost per transaction, cost per customer onboarded, cost per report generated, cost per build, cost per user served at a target latency. You don't need perfect precision. You need a stable metric that forces conversation about outcomes, not just consumption. Because Showback taught the organization to argue about data, value management forces the organization to argue about decisions. Here's what most people miss. Cost cutting is reactive. Cost shaping is intentional. Cost cutting is where we found waste, we removed waste. Great. You should still do that, but it doesn't tell you where to invest next, and it doesn't create a repeatable pattern that prevents the same waste from reappearing under a different name. Cost shaping is, we will spend here, not there, because this is what the business prioritizes. And then you enforce that with guardrails, budgets, and workflows, so it isn't just a meeting outcome that evaporates. This is also why FinOps can't be a finance-led exercise or an engineering-led exercise. Finance alone will optimize for predictability and reduction. Engineering alone will optimize for delivery and performance. Both of those are rational. Both of those are incomplete. So the mature model is a cross-functional decision loop, IT, finance, and the business operating as one system that makes trade-offs explicitly, records them, and revisits them when reality changes. That's governance as strategy execution, not a policy document, not a steering committee. Strategy execution means the priorities show up in the platform. Which SKUs are allowed, which regions are permitted, what gets auto-stopped in non-prod, what requires approval, which exceptions are tolerated, how budgets escalate, how renewals happen. If those priorities aren't encoded, then the real strategy is whatever engineers do under pressure and whatever procurement renews by default. Now, the hardest shift for leadership is this. Stop celebrating savings in isolation. Savings are often just deferred risk, or they are the artifact of a one-time cleanup that didn't change starting conditions, or they are the result of shifting cost somewhere else, a different subscription, a different cost center, a different SKU, a different vendor. And if AI is involved, savings can be a rounding error against sprawl. So the better question is, did the organization improve its ability to make decisions with intent? Did unknown spend shrink? Did exception debt shrink? Did volatility shrink? Did the time from anomaly to decision shrink? Did the system get better at forecasting because the underlying ownership and allocation model got less ambiguous? Those are control indicators, and control is what makes value measurable. Now connect it back to their world. A product team that can see its cost per customer and has authority over its budget can decide whether to buy performance, buy resiliency, or buy speed. That's adult decision making. A platform team that can allocate shared services intentionally can justify a platform tax and reinvest in security, reliability, and automation instead of begging for headcount every quarter. A finance partner who can see variability drivers can stop treating cloud as a runaway train and start treating it like any other managed portfolio with risk, return, and constraints. That's the point. Showback tells you what happened. Governance tells the platform what is allowed to happen next. Value-driven cloud financial management is what you get when that governance loop doesn't just reduce waste. It directs investment toward outcomes the business can defend. A pragmatic maturity path. How to escape the trap without boiling the ocean. Now the pragmatic part, because the fastest way to kill this is to turn it into a multi-year transformation program with a logo. Most organizations don't fail because they didn't know what good looks like. They fail because they tried to implement all of it at once, offended everyone, and then quietly downgraded governance back to Showback with extra meetings. So the maturity path has to be sequential, not for methodology reasons, for entropy reasons. You can't automate accountability until you can root it. You can't root it until you can attribute it, and you can't attribute it if your estate can't even be enumerated. Phase 1 is inventory, ownership mapping, and tagging enforcement. Inventory means you can enumerate tenants, subscriptions, resource groups, and major cost surfaces without discovering new ones every week. Shadow subscriptions are not a FinOps problem. They are a governance boundary problem. Ownership mapping means every subscription has a boundary owner and every workload has a named accountable owner. Not aspirational, actual. If you can't name it, you don't govern it. Tagging enforcement means you move from tag compliance score to resources can't exist without cost center and owner. Start with audit if you must, but the outcome is deny for missing attribution. This phase doesn't require cultural miracles. It requires the organization to accept one uncomfortable invariant. Anonymous spend is not allowed. Your scoreboard in phase 1 is simple. unallocated spend percentage, number of unowned resources, and the drift rate of tag validity. If those aren't improving, stop. Don't move on. You're building automation on sand. Phase 2 is budgets, alerting, and escalation contracts. This is where you convert visibility into decision triggers. Budgets at the right scopes, owned by the right people, with an explicit escalation ladder. And you measure response, not awareness. If an alert fires and nobody responds, that's not a tooling gap. That's a governance failure you can quantify. Time to acknowledge, time to decide, time to close. Treat it like incident response metrics because functionally that's what it is. The scoreboard here is volatility and response. Cost spikes detected earlier, fewer surprises at month end, and shrinking time to decision when variance happens. Phase 3 is automation, quarantine, and exception lifecycle management. This is where you actually get leverage. You wire budget breaches and anomaly signals into workflows. You enforce exception expiry. You quarantine unowned assets. You implement remediation tiers so the platform can reduce burn while humans argue. And you keep it deliberately narrow at first. Pick one class of resource that is safe to act on, where the business impact is low and the waste is common. Unowned dev VMs, unattached disks, idle public IPs, abandoned test databases, stale snapshots. Then make that class governable end-to-end. Detect, root, act, and close with evidence. If you can't close the loop on one class of waste, you can't scale to the rest. Now, the culture reality that sits underneath all three phases is this. Executive sponsorship is the only scalable prioritization engine. Engineers don't ignore cost because they don't care. They ignore it because their priority stack is already full and cost isn't allowed to outrank delivery. Until leadership makes cost variance a first-class operational risk, the system will root around your controls, quietly, predictably. That's why you don't sell this as savings. You sell it as control, fewer surprises, faster decisions, lower entropy, clearer ownership, and a reduced ability for spend to hide. And you don't need perfection. You need directional stability. Orphan count trending down, exception age distribution trending shorter, unallocated spend trending towards zero, volatility trending down, and your mean time to resolve anomalies shrinking. If those 5 trend lines move, you escape the Showback Trap. If they don't, you're still doing theater, just with nicer dashboards. Conclusion: accountability is enforced, not reported. Showback creates awareness, but awareness doesn't change system behavior. Enforced ownership, constraints, and workflows do. If you want a practical blueprint for turning Microsoft spend into a real system of action, guardrails, escalation contracts, and time-bound exceptions, watch the next episode and subscribe so you don't miss it.